It's simple, Jezrien said, walking away. We tell them that they finally won. It's an easy enough lie. Who knows? Maybe it will turn out to be true.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello, I am Adam, and I'll be the Ardent for this episode as we cover the Prelude to the Stormlight Archive.
I'm Liz, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
I'm Elle, and I'm the Veristitalian.
Okay, so as our Worldsinger, I'm going to start by telling you a story. And this isn't so much a story as like a feeling. And I remember having this feeling at several points throughout my educational career. The first time I can remember feeling it was when I took a humanities class in high school, and we were studying all these different periods of artistic history and trying to remember all the names. And then again, when I was taking a World Civ class in college and studying all the different philosophers and all of these different texts, and just having this sense of like the crushing weight of history and how much there is to know and how much you can never catch up to this conversation that you're trying to be a part of. The summary of this feeling I would give is that, like, I recognize that there's clear advantages to being born nowadays, right? Indoor plumbing, it's going to be big. But there's also a sense in which being born late in history is a disadvantage because we have all of these other people who've already filled up the idea space that we're trying to participate in. And I always have this sense that somebody has probably already said this and I don't know enough to say something. Plato probably didn't struggle with the idea of everything already being said. He doesn't have to have footnotes. He can just talk with his friends, right? So yeah, that's the world singing I wanted to do today, to talk about this sense of history and the anxiety of influence, I suppose.
So I am taking the storm's eye view. I decide to do 10 10-word sentences for my summary. Not quite a kind of thing, but a formal structure anyways, because I thought it would be fun, and it was. So here's our summary. Kalak is one of 10 immortal heralds protecting Roshar and humans. He meets Jezrien at the predetermined location for surviving heralds. Perhaps, he thinks, everyone else had died in the fighting. The ground holds 7 honor blades. The other heralds simply left. Kalak dreads returning to torture. The Oath Pact will be abandoned. Ishar hopes Talonel's suffering and damnation will maintain the Oath Pact. Broken heralds plan to lie, telling humans they finally won. Radiance may be their only hope as heralds abandon them. Like the shards, they vow to not seek one another. Kalak leaves with shame and sorrow, praying for Talon's forgiveness.
Ooh, excellent.
I think we all pray for Tom's forgiveness at the end of the day. Or at least, like, for, not for forgiveness, but, like, just, like, that he'll get justice at the end of that, right? And then be able to also overcome that own negative feelings around it. Not to start doing a reading, but to think about that last line there, which is, I think, a stream through the entire series. As the Ardent, I'm going to move us on to thinking about our theme and our reading for the Stormlight Archive, for the prelude to the entire archive, which has a lot of weight on its shoulders when you think about it. This is a 5-book, 10-book series, and this is a prelude to all of it. And usually a prelude in a series is something that introduces you to all the themes and all of the connections and all of the ideas that are going to come up in the big, long series. It's the moment in Sanderson's work that's just like when Adam and Eve are created, right? It's that big epic start. And he starts it at the end of a battle, as Elle was saying in the Storm's Eye view. It's this end of the battle, he's left. And when I was approaching this, I was thinking about the theme and the topic of history and dispensations. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they teach a long history of the earth to relate it back to the gospel that's taught within the church. And it's this series throughout time of dispensations, of time periods where God reveals his truth to his children, and time periods of what's called apostasy, where he takes that truth away. And Mormons view the long history of the earth through this giving truth, truth's not there. Giving truth, truth's not there. And I wanted us to think through this theme and topic of dispensations, because it's I think, a very Mormon Latter-day Saint way of looking at history, looking at the broad history. And the prelude here is a moment in history.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I mean, there are other Christian dispensationalists, right? But what's unique to the Mormon view of dispensations is this idea of that they're sort of in a way equal to each other, that every dispensation, it's not progressing through time, but every dispensation has this fullness of truth, and then it gets lost, and then it comes back and it gets lost. So there is like progression and retreat, but it's not like the first dispensations were practiced and they were not as good, and now we are so much better. It's kind of more equal across time, that it's cyclical.
They're building on each other. Like, that's part of the intention of, like, you get a little bit of truth in this first one and then a little bit more truth in this one, which I think, like, comes up with the Desolations, or at least was, like, some of the hope of the Heralds was, oh, there's enough time for us to, like, build up, and so that the Heralds will continue the history, will help provide additional information or whatever.
Yeah, it pulls into the broader aspect of the problem at the very beginning of when that promise between the two sides was made, when that tension was like placed between them, right? When the people from Ashen came to Roshar and, invading the homeworld of the harsh people, that started this cycle. And it's a cyclical thing through history that Sanderson's capturing. And this is the moment where it's a moment that, what's the right word here, that cuts history. They're saying no more. We've done this for how long, like 8,000 years or something? I forget what the exact time is. Like 8,500 years later is what the book starts, right? And they've been doing this already for X amount of thousands of years. And it's a moment of that cuts the dispensation, much like how Mormonism cuts the dispensations as well, because they see this as like a final dispensation, as the latter days. And so the prelude itself is cutting into that and stopping it. But then it's still so many years later that then we come to Kaladin finally, and the big assumption of the consequence of that cut, which I think is important to think about with the prelude. I'll ask a question here, but thinking about dispensations, thinking about your own experience in Mormonism, how has that shaped your thinking of history to think about it in this longer process? And how has that acted out in your life when you're thinking about history?
I don't know if this is specifically Mormon, but I think in some ways it's being aware of history is somewhat an antidote to chronological snobbery, I believe, is the term. This idea that, oh, those people back then didn't know as much as us. They weren't as much people as we are. Somehow they weren't as intelligent. And the idea of dispensations lets you think about, no, they had intelligence, they had a way that they were trying to deal with the realities of life, even if the technology level was different. They were still people, and their choices were just as real and valid as ours. They weren't making them out of instinct or anything that's less human. They're real humans. So to me, it brings the past to be something that's real and always present with me, which is maybe why I struggle with the weight of history, because I feel like they're all equally valid and I need to talk to all of them.
I think it was, at least when I was younger and thinking about it, thinking about time more from a Mormon perspective and less of an academic perspective, it was a little bit more of what was the responsibility of each dispensation? There was definitely a feeling oh, there was that folklore of, well, you've been saved for the latter days for these particular reasons. And so your job in these last days for which you have been saved is to cope with the latter day experience. I And like, oh, people living at X, Y, or Z time had the skills to cope with that living experience, or like were intended for that experience. And it was definitely a perspective of like intentionality that I don't know whether or not I still feel like that's true. Like intentionally being like, okay, this is the subset of people that will, God saying this is the subset that will live during the 2000s, the subset for the 1000s or whatever. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to think about like framing them in terms of purpose or intention. Like that does seem like an interesting way to think about history of like, what was the intention of the people living at this time?
Yeah, I had that same growing up, because like I think what's interesting in our space here is that both of you grew up as women in the church, and I grew up as a man in the church, which in the Church of Christ, gender is separated, right? And so going to religious society is different than going to priesthood. Just in some ways of how they talk, right? Because I was always told, like, you are a priesthood holder and you were foreordained to come here, in a sense of like, this is, you are held back for that strength, which you were talking about, Al. And priesthood, they then say like, so that you can be a leader in the church, so that you could potentially be a prophet or an apostle. And I think that's something that's like shared over and over again in priesthood, to give that sense of authority, that weight around decisions. And it's using history in some way to compel you and encourage you forward, right? To take on that weight, to take on that goal of history, where it's like, you're here to help bring about this really great thing. You're a part of this dispensation to bring about Jesus Christ coming again, which is a lot of weight to put on like a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, if we think about it. But it helps really guide you and prepare you for the world at the same time. Like whenever I'm in my 30s, right? And I approach things, I feel a weight, even if it's like not a Mormon thing, even if it's like my academic work, if it's my work outside, or even with relationships, there's still that sense of weight, that sense of mantle, that sense of responsibility, that growing up in a church that, you know, pulls history into it and makes itself a part of all history, like adds on to you as you grow up.
I'm thinking about, Adam, when we were talking about this episode, you brought up the illustration that comes later in the book. So we're out of order now, of the history of man. And so we do have this sense of like each era in Rosharan history has a specific purpose, right? So we've got the expulsion, the loss of the Tranquiline Halls, the desolations, the war against the Voidbringers, Ahari Etiam, the last desolation, the defeat of the Voidbringers, which we're watching, the Recreants, the fall of the Knights Radiant, and then the Hierocracy, the failure of Vorinism. So they have very carefully like given each period of history a clear label and a purpose as to what's happened. And we do this even with secular history, right? We've got, first comes the Renaissance, and then very neatly comes the next, then we're in the Enlightenment, and then we're going to be in the Industrial Revolution. And we treat these as though they're very discrete periods of history when actually they're overlapping, right? We've got people still doing medieval things all the way through the Enlightenment. We've got people doing some science and things earlier than we would call the Enlightenment. So there's a way in which periodizing history can also be lying to us, because these things are very slishy-sloshy.
Oh, this is like the fact that like Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born the same year, I think, or very close to each other. But we see them as very separate periods of history. We see Anne Frank in World War II and the Holocaust, whereas we see Martin Luther King Jr. as like the face of the civil rights movement. And like those feel like discrete periods of history that they were both living through.
I think that plays out a lot across the books, because what we're looking at when it comes to the history of man is the history of man as told by the ardentia, which the ardentia are not the only religion across Roshar, right? So there's a different history. I'm thinking about the people who, I'm going to forget their names, so you're going to have to remind me. They came from one Cosmere area to Roshar, and then they leave it in Wind and Truth.
Oh, the Iriali.
Yeah, the Iriali,
Yes.
Thank you. So they have a different view of history. They have a different telling of history, a different narrative of history. And this like keeps coming out.
Right, all the different journeys. That's very dispensational too, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the lines that I highlighted was a comment, I think from Kalak, where he asked Jezreel, what will they say of this day? And like, I like wrote a note. I was like, how is history written and who writes that history? Because so many people believe that history that initial herald wrote that, oh, we won. It's fine. We won. When that wasn't. We're already being told at the beginning that history is a lie. And I think that's interesting to think about who is forming that historical context and why are they forming the historical context that way.
And that plays into a lot that opening quote that I chose, which was Jezreel like responding to that question where, Kalak asks, how are we going to tell it, as you said? And then he says it's simple. We tell them that they finally won. But then who knows, maybe it will turn out to be true. There's such hope and faith in that. Also, there's hope and faith in that, right? That yes, hopefully it's true, maybe it will. But also he knows it's not true. And so there's this dissonance between that of his hope. Yeah, I really hope this will work out. If one person's holding the oath pack, maybe it'll hold together. Or he knows it won't. And so that reality is very crushing. But the hope and faith is still trying to overcome that sense of like, maybe, just maybe. And that's like one of the core tensions, I think, in this prelude, where it's, we're doing big things, we're pushing back the void bringers, but we're doing it at the expense of our mental health, at the expense of our very souls in some ways, as we are doing the sacrifice that we've made.
One thing I noticed as I was reading through this lens was the tenses that are used and the time words that are used throughout this chapter, right? In the beginning, we start with lots of past tense. We've got, they faded. He'd been killed by hands like those before. Had fought. I survived this time. So we're always in the past. As always, even after all these centuries, once fine clothing. And then when Kalak starts talking to Jezreel, we switch to the present tense. It is time for the oath pact to end. And I think that's why that hits so hard, is because we're transitioning from this mode of history to the present. We're making a decision. And then the rest of the chapter, we have a whole bunch of present tense. That will be enough. He will remain bound. We will go our own ways. So there is very much this sense of history shifting to the present, to a new period of history that's very intentionally set up by the language in this chapter.
What I think is interesting, though, is that I noticed a lot, like, centuries was used, like, over and over again. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like if I had been writing this, I would have been like, man, I used centuries so many times. Maybe I should have, like, cut back or something. But it's Kalak that is like, oh, Jezreel looks like he has been a king for centuries. And so I feel like Kalak is still in the mindset. He hasn't quite shifted to this is a now decision, whereas Jezreel had some time to reflect and think and change and be like, okay, now we're going to think about the present. Whereas Kalak is still dealing with the trauma of this has been going on forever. And it made me think about, to give a Mormon moment, the Three Nephites, and to some extent John the Revelator, but the Three Nephites, in the Book of Mormon, Christ visits the Nephites, and three of them are given the same blessing that John was given in the Bible, which is to not age or die. And so in Mormon lore, the Three Nephites are just, I guess, wandering the earth, helping people is how they usually show up in folklore. Like a flat tire happens and three random strangers show up and help fix the tire. But I found myself thinking of the perspective of those three Nephites and thinking about what it would be like to watch the world continually falling apart around you. And like, do you gain a different sense of perspective to be living through? And I think at least with Kalak, because, we haven't actually experienced this, so I don't know what it would be like to write it. But Kalak, his perspective is it's draining. It's not beneficial. It's like a thing happening year after year after century. And I don't envy the Three Nephites, I guess, is my thought on that. That sounds exhausting.
I think as well, it like thinking about the Three Nephites in relation to cognitive shadows in the entire Stormlight archive, but also the broader Cosmere, right? When someone makes that decision, I'm thinking specifically of a character who would be a spoiler for other books. But I think when someone makes that decision, because in the Cosmere, you can make that decision in very specific ways, right? To become this thing that lasts longer. And you're making a decision to say, I'm going to give up my simple mortality, which is what we, as the human beings reading the book, always think give us purpose, right? We enter this world, we're alive, we have an eventual death, and between that time period, there's some sense of purpose given to us, right? That's the Freudian death drive, where you're always moving toward death, which means that is what drives you in life, and that is what builds you up. And it's interesting that Sanderson, I think, pulling on Mormon theology, because in Mormon theology, we have that broader view of eventually we'll give off mortality, become gods, but also it's a longer view of the human existence beyond life. And I think Sanderson's playing with that in a lot of the text, right? Of how do I understand that? What happens to a mortal being who is instantaneously switched from mortal to immortal? And Kalak, as you said, has that depression, has that has that sense of I've lost my intelligence, I've lost my, I'm struggling with this, in other words. And Jezreel has that. Eventually you see him super struggle with it, because you see him in his very catatonic state later in the books. But here he's made that moment of sincere choice, that switch. And I think relating that back to Liz's story at the beginning, especially when you have that weight of history on you, you have to have a switch where you go and do the work, where you sit down. I think the weight of history for you, if I'm understanding right from your world singing, it's that weight of history of when you're writing about a text, or when you're dealing with history in an academic way, and you have all this other stuff that people have written, and you can't pull all that in, but you still have to write the paper. You still have to give the lesson. You still have to teach the class. And I think that's like some way that we deal with that weight of history is by putting our nose to the ground, doing what Jezreel did, which is to make a decision and live with it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how we could apply this almost in also a psychology kind of way, that there are moments in your life that are the turning point that you decide to change the pattern that you're stuck in, right? You change something that you're going through that's always been this way, and you feel like it's the way things are and there's nothing you can do about it. And sometimes it takes someone else coming in, like Jezreel does, and says, hey, like, let's do something different. Let's try to change the way history is going here. And that can be liberating, like it is for Kalak in maybe an ambiguous way here. But somebody coming in and saying, no, you don't have to keep repeating this pattern. We don't have to keep doing this cycle. We can change.
I think we see that to bring in the postlude that's in Wind and Truth. Kaladin then steps in for Kalak again and says, hey, let's stop this pattern. Let's try something different this time. And I think that's a really interesting thing to see, the prelude and the postlude. Both of them, Kalak is struggling with the weight of history and the weight of existence, and someone else steps in to say, hey, let's try to do something different now. Let's see if something else will work.
I think that relates back to a way to restore or re-envision our view of dispensations when it comes to like a Mormon view of it, right? Where it's, if we're looking for the humans, it's trying to understand God's will each time in a different way or in a similar way at the same time and connecting across time. But again, things change, just as they changed between when Kalak and Jezreel and all them gave up their swords to when the Oath Pact was reformed with Kaladin being a part of it. The world changed and something had to change with it. The understanding had to change with it, but the core aspect of it had to stay the same. And I think that's a very Mormon way of viewing that dispensation and viewing that change across the 5 books, at least, is, and it's one of the things that they bring up in the later books when Taln and Shalash appear in like book 4 and book 3, and they're like, the world's changed so much. They were able to finally thrive. They were able to finally come to this moment. And because of all that, now we can reassess how we're living this core principle and truth, which is this oath pact that has to be lived by in order to do something. I think thinking about dispensations in that way helps, I think, a little bit tame that worry that Liz brought up in the world singing of the weight of history. I don't think it removes the weight of history, but it also, I think, helps us psychologically deal with it. All right, so moving to the sacred reading, part of this podcast, we were talking about this a little bit before, is wanting to give sacred readings as sacred readings have been provided, but also give sacred readings that are focused a little bit on a Mormon application within the reading. And so a literary technique that's Mormon. And for this sacred reading, I created or thought through a sacred reading that would relate to Mormon theology. And I call the sacred reading Kinmaking. So in Mormonism, there's a big desire to form kinship between people. I think in present day Mormonism, that kinship is formed through a ward congregation wanting to be a ward family, meaning the local congregation wanting to be seen as, this family that cares about each other, where you have ministering brothers and ministering sisters who are the people that come and visit you as your brothers and sisters, this family relationship, this kinship that we're forming between each other. And it relates all the way back to the history of Mormonism to Joseph Smith, who when he thought through, there's a lot of arguments around how he thought through polygamy and how he thought through relationships between individual people and us and God. And a lot of scholars argue that that was a kinship formation project. It was a way of forming an eternal family altogether. And so a sacred reading called Kinmaking would be looking at a text and thinking, how are relationships built between characters within the text within that chapter? So I kind of want to do that for us with the Prelude, thinking through, we only have two characters roughly, so Kalak and Jezreel, and thinking through the kinship between Kalak and Jezreel, the kinship between others. So we have to start out the sacred reading by first asking ourselves, who does this character have kinship with and who does it not? And I want us to think through in this kin making, as we're, making who's his kin and who is not, think beyond what's in the text and think about, the broader Rosharan system. So what do y'all think? Kalak, who does he specifically have kinship with and who does he not have kinship with?
I think this is a really interesting technique to use in the chapter we're talking about, the Oath Pact, because kin making and bondsmithing feel very similar, right? So we've got the Oath Pact, right? So Kalak and Jezreel have this kinship with all the other members of the Oath Pact, that they're all connected through this shared purpose, this shared agreement that this is what they're going to do for the people of Roshar.
So it has, the Oath Pact has the connection with all 10 of the Heralds, but then you also have a connection with honor, which then, if you want to extrapolate, honor then has a connection with the other shards connecting to Adonalsium. I think that with Kalak, we see him come up later in the series. He often appears with Nail, he follows Nail. We see in the Prelude, or not the Prelude, we see Kalak in the prologue with Nail, and he seems connected to Nail throughout the book, but he also seems very isolated, and in a way that I think was intended when they go their separate ways. Throughout the books, we see Kalak he's trying to hold, at least to some extent, to we're not going to seek each other out. Whereas we see Ash and Taln are together when we often see them. Kalak feels very lonely. Every perspective we get from Kalak, it feels very isolated. Not just in this section where he is still thinking about history, but in Rhythm of War when he shows up at the Honor Spren stronghold, he still feels isolated and alone. He does have those connections that are tenuous through the Oath Pact, but he doesn't seem very participating in them. He doesn't seem to be trying to lean on those connections, if that makes sense.
Well, so if we're taking that reading and accepting it, which I think it's a good reading of Kalak as having strained relationships with almost everyone, you're kind of, in my understanding of what you're saying, you're seeing all of his kinship with Jezreel, it feels very like demure, to use the social media term, but it seems very like he's kind of subservient in some ways, or he's he always kind of views himself as lesser, as little in comparison, and as relying on perhaps a relationship. Here I'm thinking specifically about, and I don't want to go as far as this, but in Harry Potter, Peter Pettigrew's relationship to everyone, where it's always kind of, I don't think Kalak is that. I think it's a little bit more complicated than Pettigrew's type of relationship to like Voldemort and others. But his kinship is, where would we kind of end up with that? His forms of kinship are...
I think they're strained. I think when we talk about Mormon relationship building, there's, at least in like the official church, like description of like how people leave the church, they often talk about like people isolating themselves and not being willing to form connections. And while I think that there's a lot of nuance, that's like a different conversation about that, I think that Kalak's struggle, or like one of the reasons that he is having such a hard time and needs people to like reach out and intervene, is because he has isolated himself and has like not put himself equal to these people that he is clearly equal to, because he is a herald on that level, and needs the intervention of other people. Like, I know in my own life, when I am feeling in a way that I want to isolate myself, it is much harder to feel good about who I am and like, and to feel confident in my own self-worth. And so when I am better at making connections with other people, it is easier for me. It's not easy. It is easier for me to feel better and to be able to like bear the weight of the things I am dealing with. And I don't think Kalak like has realized or does realize that he needs connections with other people to support himself. I think those kinship bonds are extremely important, and he just like, that has not been a priority for him, or a way he has looked at the kinship that he could have.
I think there's also a consequence of not making that kinship and connection. Because if I'm remembering correctly, which correct my Sanderson lore here, Kalak's the will shaper herald, right?
Let me double check.
El will do the copper
I'm
mind
on copper
here.
mind. We're fine.
El will do the copper mind.
I'm on it. It's fine.
He's the one of judgment, right?
He is will shapers.
And the will shapers are the ones that come back through the Parshindi, right? Not through humans, but like the ones who are the radiants that are will shapers in this time of our Eshonai and Vinley, right? And I think that's interesting that for the radiants, there's such a deep connection to humanity, which we'll get into this probably as time goes on. But what I'm trying to point out here is that his strained relationships have a consequence of losing humanity's sense of the will shapers, along with other consequences of all of what the Radiants made in their decisions, right? But I wonder if there's a tension here where it's like Kalak's lack of kinmaking that we're kind of pulling out here, that we're teasing out, is something that causes that part of that consequence down the road, right? Is that if we're not as strong in our kinship, if we're not as strong in our relationships with others, if we fall back into that sense of not even being strong in ourselves as we make those kinship formations, what are the consequences of that? And it's not a consequence in a bad way, because I don't want to say the Parshindi getting this power is a bad thing, but it's just like something that happened.
So something that's like I was really interested in when you were talking about, first of all, will shapers are cohesion, which is like making and forming bonds, but also the listeners specifically have a really good kinship network. And like, it's really fascinating to see like Kalak's experience with kinship being like so isolated, but then the new like generation of will shapers has to rely on such a strong kinship network that we don't really see it. I mean, we maybe see them in like her dad's, I would say, has a pretty strong kinship network, but like of the like groups of people, like the listeners were the perfect group they were protecting like the least among them and wanting to keep them safe and protected. And I think that you're like kind of onto something with like Kalak not forming those kinship bonds changed how will shapers could appear in the future.
And what's also interesting about the kinship of the Parshini is and the listeners is that they have a closer relationship with the world, right? With what's around them.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about kinship and kinmaking, we can't just think about, being to being. We have to think about being to environment, being to the world around us. Which I think here, Kalak is a little bit human-centric, anthropocentric when he's thinking, because he's always thinking about like, what will this cause humanity? And he points out to the blood, right? And he like kind of like throws away the listener blood, or not the listener blood, the harsh blood there, right? Because I don't think they're quite listeners.
I think they go by singers.
That's the right word.
Yeah.
They're singers.
The longer history of this 1,000-page whatever is a lot to hold. That's the weight over us.
I think it's also interesting to notice that Kalak doesn't have a lot of relationships with the humans that he's defending anymore, right? When they first make the Oath Pact, it's because they care about these people who are refugees from a world that they know, right? But throughout this chapter, all of the humans he's defending are very abstracted. Their blood, their groans. Okay, we get the survivors, and that's it. They're very abstracted into this noun humanity, but he doesn't have any real connection with them. And that can be a risk when you are at high levels of power and representing people in a government, that you start to abstract people and don't have these kin relationships with them that can humanize your desire to protect them, right? Like Kalak has forgotten why he decided to do the Oath Pact, and that makes it easy to do this betrayal of the Oath Pact because he doesn't have a relationship with the people who he's chosen to make this sacrifice for. And
almost all of them, heralds have more of a kinship with the pain than with the people, right? That pain of having to be tortured for so long has overcome the relationships that they form, and like even remembering those relationships, even having that memory of them to sustain them through it.
So our final section of the podcast is to kind of summarize what we can do with this knowledge, which we call the wisdom of the heralds. My thoughts are about this kinship connection you've pointed out. As a parent, it's easy to fall into thinking of parenthood as a job, right? And these are the things that need to get done in the checklist, and losing that kinship relationship and why we're doing these things. Why am I making lunches for my kids? So that's something I want to focus on more this week because we read this chapter this way.
For me, my life, since I don't quite have a family living with me, I don't have a partner, I don't have kids. So my kinship is mostly with my fellow graduate students. And this year, actually, I am the president of our Graduate Student Association. And one of the focuses that I've had, and this has helped me kind of strengthen that focus that I want to take into the year, is building more relationships between the grad students in our program and the faculty in our program. Since in an academic PhD program, it's very much an apprenticeship where you're learning how to do the job of an academic from academics who are in there. But there can sometimes the relationship between the two can fray a lot because the academics can be kind of in their own world, while the grad students are all very just like, I want to do this, I want to be great, and I want to, think smart things. And which is, I think both are fine things to do. But in focusing on the relationship, one thing that we've been talking about today is how that relationship always has a background of the history to it. And you can, as Liz was saying, get lost in the job part of it. And I think in my desire to create stronger relationships between my fellow grad students and the faculty who are the higher people at the job, I think a way to do that is to pull history a little bit away, that weight of history that's like driving derision between us, but also to reinvest in, it is a job, it is a thing we're doing every day, but it's also each of us are human beings who like need some form of connection with each other. We don't need to remember the pain of the work itself. We need to think through the relationship between us. And I think that's what I'm going to take away from this, is just doing a better job at pulling back the hard part of a working environment and reinvesting in. We're all humans together trying to get through this thing called life.
I'm feeling a little torn. On one hand, like, I feel like I am dealing with like both of the things that you are talking, like both of you are talking about. Like, on one hand, I'm like, I want to build a better relationship in and with like my kid and my husband. But I think what I want to be connecting to this week is, since I've recently moved, I have been recently assigned a ministering companion and ministering people to minister to. And ministering and formally visiting teaching has always been a minefield for me. As a tangent, when I was a freshman in college, I remember like having a snowball fight with one of my friends who I was also supposed to be like her visiting teacher. And I turned to her and I was like, does this count for my visiting teaching? And so I think for me, what I want to do is at very least make the connection with the person who has been selected to be like my companion and a potential friend. And this is a person who I've like made connections with in the past before, as I've participated in church things. And building a kinship outside of my family feels really important, to feel like I have roots here and that I am wanting to be a part of the community, because it's very easy to exist in the community without being a part of it. And making at least one friend, one connection where I feel close to, where we already have a reason to start to get close, feels like a good way to do that.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.